All right, I see one other person. If you could just let me know in the chat if you're able to see my slides and are able to hear me. I have another monitor, but just in case. Okay, Caitlin, thanks. Um, all right, I guess it's 3 Eastern, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to the last Proteus TV episode of this year. For people who have not been to this show, um, this is the Proteus Institute, and we are interested in um, bridging biology with artificial intelligence. The institute is led by Josh Bongard, Michael Levin, Melanie Massas, and Nick Shaney. My name is Santosh, and I'm a postdoc working with Michael Levin at Tufts University Center for Regenerative Developmental Biology. Today, I wanted to talk to you about the topic of interpretability in artificial intelligence and complex systems, emphasis on and. I'll explain the reason why shortly. I want to begin with a famous quote from Richard Feynman that goes, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." I think in the modern age of AI, he might have said something like, "What I create, I still don't quite understand." And that pretty much sums up one of the core challenges of artificial intelligence as it stands today. Um, we have seen major advances in artificial intelligence, and we have seen AI help solve a number of problems for us. But one of the core challenges has been how those machines, the artificially intelligent machines, work in the first place. Um, and an entirely new field is budding to tackle this challenge, and I think one could call that field interpretability, the challenge of interpretability. So before I move on, I want to make it clear what we exactly mean by interpretability. Um, I'm not an expert on this topic. I've been scouring the literature myself out of my own interest, and I found that even the most recent review papers don't um, quite clearly define what's meant by interpretability. But for all intents and purposes, we can say that it is the ability to explain or to present in understandable terms to a human, or it's the degree to which a human can consistently predict a model's result. I think in general, the more interpretable an AI system is, the easier it is to understand how it works, how it makes its decisions, and in general, to identify the underlying cause and effect relationships. Um, so, but why is interpretability important in the first place? I think the deep answer is sort of philosophical in nature. I think it all boils down to the human condition, which is to to be in control. Humans like to be in control. We seek certainty in everything, and we are terrible in handling uncertainty in general. But philosophy aside, I think there are uh, numerous practical reasons why we should care about interpretability. One is health. So we know that there are a number of AI-based tools that's being developed um, that doctors use to for both the purpose of diagnosis and prognosis. Um, so, for example, there are AI-based tools that are really good at picking up subtle patterns in radiological images that the human eye is not really trained to pick up. Um, and I'm familiar with some tools that doctors use to even prescribe um, a prognosis under like particularly complicated health conditions. So, given all this, can we entrust the life and the health of a human individual to an AI without really knowing what's really going on under the hood? Absolutely not. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we should care about interpretability. There are also other social and ethical concerns related to it, but in today's presentation, I want to focus on the technical aspects of it, of interpretability. How is interpretability implemented? What sort of methods exist out there that people use under this broad label of interpretability? So to do that, I will walk you through a set of examples from two broad classes of um, AI systems. One is the traditional mainstream AI which is sort of neural networks and sort of feed forward type systems. And the other class is less mainstream, but I think it's still important. So examples under that class um, are based on what's known as recurrent neural networks, and those models have been used in besides the traditional conventional text recognition, language recognition, and so forth. They have also been used in cognitive science and also developmental biology, which is where my work falls under, and I will be talking about that as well. Um, so let's start with the traditional AI systems, which is sort of feed forward networks. I will explain what I mean by that in a second. So here's the simplest example. Here's an example of, let me bring up my pointer. Here's an example of a very simple two-layer neural network that can be trained to recognize handwritten digits. So that it has just two layers, as I mentioned, an input layer and an output layer. The input layer basically consists of all the pixels from the image, and there are 10 different possible outputs for this network, each corresponding to the digit shown in the image. So if the input image looks something like this, like the digit 6, then the output unit corresponding to the digit 6 right over here should turn on, while the others should remain off. Um, and the training of this network involving computing the weights. So the weights is basically, so every output unit has a connection to every single pixel, every single input pixel. And every one of these edges has a particular value known as the weight. So the problem is to compute an appropriate set of weights so that this network works as expected. So if you show a number 5, the output unit 5 should glow, the others should be off, and so on and so forth. So how do we interpret this simple linear classifier? There are two main approaches. One is basically visualize the distribution of the weights for a particular output unit. For example, if you take the output unit corresponding to the digit 3, as I mentioned before, that unit, as every other output unit, is connected to every single input pixel, and every one of those connections has a weight. So this is a visualization of those weights. And I think the red colors mean positive weights, and the blue color means negative weights. But the basic idea here is that you can sort of pick up a broad contour of the number 3 over here. It's kind of, you can follow it in white. It's difficult to see, but there it is. This is the broad sort of contour. So you can see, so this is one way to interpret the network. What this means is that the output unit corresponding to the number 3 um, is sensitive, is trained to see different variants of number 3. I think one reason why you don't exactly see the number 3 is for the purposes of generalization, because handwritten digits are not do not follow the same style. So it has to be sort of blurry in order for this network to respond to different varieties of styles. Another way to interpret this network is what's known as the attribution method. So what you're looking at here is basically the derivative, the mathematical derivative of the output corresponding to digit 3 to each of the input pixels. So it's the derivative is basically a calculus terminology. So the derivative of y with respect to x just means that y changes in a particular way as you change x a little bit. So the darker, I think the white pixels here means that the derivatives are high. So what this means is that the output unit is sensitive to this part of the image the most, because that's where the derivatives are the largest. So these are two simple, really simple methods to understand this simple linear classifier that's trained to recognize handwritten digits. But when we move on to more complex neural networks, like the one shown here, this one is a convolutional neural network trained for image recognition purposes. As you can see, it's a really complex network. So to interpret networks like these, things can get complicated, but still methods have been developed, and I'm going to walk you through a set of simple examples. Um, I don't want to delve into the details of how or, or how a CNN is constructed and how it's different, but I think it suffices to say that CNNs are different from traditional neural networks, like the one I showed you before, in terms of their connectivity. So the neurons here have a small receptive field and sort of inspired by the human visual system. Every neuron focuses on a small part of the input image, and the reason for that is because natural images have spatial dependencies. So the images are not completely random, they're not messed up, they have smooth variations. And the architecture of a CNN sort of capitalizes on that property. Um, so a number of methods have been developed to interpret how things work in a CNN, and they fall into two broad categories. One is called feature visualization, the other is called attribution. Attribution is basically a set of methods that are similar to the derivative method that I showed you before. So what they do is help answer the question of um, what parts of an input image a particular neuron is most sensitive to. So that's kind of what we saw in the linear classifier, where we saw a map of derivatives, and we saw that the output neuron corresponding to number 3 is most sensitive to the parts of the image that follow the digit 3. So that's what attribution methods do in general. But there is also another method called feature visualization. What they do is help answer the question of um, what sorts of input images a neuron is looking for. So what they do here is um, sort of optimize an input image that maximizes a particular neuron's activation. So when you do that, you end up with images like this. And this is the basic idea behind the methods underlying what's famously known as a Google Deep Dream. So you might have seen those. Yes, exactly. That's deep dreaming. Um, as just responding to the question in the chat. And yeah, it's when you run this method, you end up with like really beautiful, dreamy, hallucinatory images, and that's what they are. But basically, what they do is optimize an input image. So they hold a neuron's activation to a very high level, and they optimize the input so that it matches that maximum output of the neuron of interest. Um, but then the question is, do we optimize, why should one optimize inputs when we have this huge data set of inputs? Because that's what we do when we train a neural network. We start with an input data set, say a set of images, and then we supervise the network to classify the outputs appropriately, to classify the inputs appropriately. Right? So when we have this huge input data set, why care about optimizing input images? The answer is that when you do that, you might actually be surprised to find out what the neurons are actually looking for. So here is a simple example. So here is an input data set consisting of images that match a baseball or a fan. Okay, the fan has the stripes. The baseball also has some stripes. But then when you pick one of the neurons in the CNN, um, it's called Mix4A, so we don't have to worry about the particular layer of the CNN. It just suffices to say that there is a particular neuron that responds to these images. And when you pick one of those and optimize the inputs, you end up with something like this. Does this resemble a fan? Does this resemble a baseball or something in between? It's hard to say. But what's also interesting is that it helps us sort of guess that if we show this network an image of a sunflower, the network might still respond to it because this does look like a sunflower to me. Maybe it looks like other things to you. You can type on the chat and what this looks like to you. To me, definitely reminds me of a sunflower, or perhaps maybe something similar to honeybee. I think the reason why you end up with images like this is because the neurons may have generalized to see something deeper than just the baseball or fans. Um, and that's one of the benefits of doing a feature visualization using a method like input optimization. There are other examples here. So here is an example of images consisting of buildings and blue sky. And when you optimize the input, you see sort of superposition of everything. Like there is blueness, there is also building-like structures. Um, so yeah, so this is just another interesting method to understand what a neuron in a trained network is really looking for. You can actually go beyond this and combine multiple neurons and look at and try to understand the interactions between them in the sense that what they are jointly looking for. So, for example, here is a neuron that's apparently responding to or tuned to seeing black and white images, and here's another neuron that's tuned to seeing mosaic-like images. But when you optimize the input images that jointly maximize the activations of these neurons, you end up with something like this. It's sort of a kind of a black and white grayscale mosaic. Um, so you can extend simple feature visualization images to understand the activity or the behavior of multiple neurons. So you can push it even further and understand how neurons in a network, say detect a triangle. So here's an example of 7 different neurons, each one recognizing or detecting a different feature of a triangle. So the images on the top seem to be detecting horizontal lines, and the neurons at the bottom seem to be detecting slanted lines, and together they detect a triangle. Uh, so feature visualization looks like not only helps understand the behavior of single neurons, but also help understand the behavior of multiple neurons and the emergence of higher order features, at least when it comes to recognizing images. Um, and of course, there's a whole suite of methods um, that fall into these two categories, feature visualization and attribution. They all share the same flavor in the sense that they help answer the question of what is a neuron are looking for, at least with respect to image recognition. And all of these examples, which I picked from a review paper, they're all for networks trained to recognize images. And by the way, if you were interested in learning more about this, you should definitely check out the work of Chris Olah. I think he's now with OpenAI. Maybe he was previously with Google. He has published a number of articles on this website that delve really deep into these details. Because I've glossed over all the bells and whistles of these methods, but those are very interesting if you are interested in learning more about it. Um, and as recently as just a couple of days ago, I found out that DeepMind had just released a Nature paper talking about how AI has helped make advances even in mathematics. That's something that's hard to imagine, but I looked at the paper. Basically, what they have done is a mathematician starts out with a hypothesis saying that there exists a function between x and y being some data sources of interest to the mathematician. And what they do with the AI is basically generate data or examples from X and Y and train a neural network that maps X to Y. And then what they did was, this is the interesting part, they used attribution methods, very simple ones like the gradient saliency method, which I described earlier, the derivatives method. They used something as simple as that to understand how those neural networks work, in particular, understand what features, what mathematical features of the data are relevant in are relevant for that neural network. So they use these techniques to understand those relevant input features, and then the mathematician looks at it, sharpens their intuition, and then refine their hypothesis and repeat this process. And that's what they have done. And apparently, they describe two examples in the paper, which I did not quite follow because it's heavily mathematical. But it's the basic idea here is that they have used these attribution methods to help build intuition for mathematicians so that they can refine their hypothesis and help solve conjectures or come up with new theorems or stuff like that. So that's that. Now let me move on to a different set of examples, one that involves more complex recurrent neural networks. Examples that I showed you before are mostly or all feed-forward like systems. Um, so which means that information flows from one layer to the next, to the next, to the next, and finally there is an output layer, and that's it. And that actually makes the development of certain interpretation techniques a bit easier. But when it comes to complex networks that have more recurrent connections, things get complicated. I see a question, but can we trust a math proof produced by an AI? Well, I think when it comes to mathematics, things are pretty concrete. And I know that there are actually even AI-based systems, not even AI-based systems, just computer systems that use logic, basic logic to verify whether a proof is correct or not. Because some of the proofs can run into hundreds of pages, and it's very hard for a human to go through each one of the steps and make sure that it is correct. But if you just feed it to an AI or just a computer system that can accept axioms and just basically plod through the steps, it can uh, help verify those proofs. So I think I think if an AI generates a proof, all you have to do is feed it to another computer system that can verify it, and then I would trust those systems uh, because it does not involve sort of like, at least when it comes to verifying proofs, mathematical proofs, it does not involve like creativity because everything is axiomatic. Uh, I hope that answers the question. Okay, so here's um, a different set of examples involving more complex neural networks. And my favorite one of those comes from Randy Beer's group. He is a professor of cognitive science and computer science at Indiana University Bloomington. And he and his student, Paul Williams, had built what they call a minimally cognitive agent. It's basically, it consists of a recurrent neural network to understand the concept of relational categorization. So smaller or larger. So when we humans or animals or insects um, somehow make decisions about what is smaller or larger than something else, the question is, how do we or those animals implement that in our brains? So they built a neural network model to help understand this phenomenon of relational categorization. So let me walk you through this particular setup. So as I mentioned before, it is, and thanks Josh for posting the link to Randy. Uh, so um, So this particular neural network has seven sensors. They sort of act as eyes for the agent. And there are three interneurons, basically sort of the brain of the agent, and there are two motors. So the simulation environment is set up in such a way that the agent can move horizontal. So that's why there is a left motor and a right motor. So it can move left or right in just one dimension. And what happens in the simulation is that it starts out with the agent located in some position, and there's a ball that's dropped from above towards the agent at a particular constant velocity. After a while, after the ball reaches the agent, the ball is removed from the simulation, and a second ball is dropped from the same initial position as the first, and with the same fixed velocity as before. The goal of the agent is to detect if the second ball is smaller or larger and express its decision um, by catching the ball if the second ball is smaller and by avoiding it if the second ball is larger. So that's basically the goal of the agent, and they trained a neural network that looks like this. And as I mentioned before, it's recurrent, so all the interneurons are interconnected, but everything else is feed-forward. So the connections from the sensors to the interneurons is just one direction, and the connections from the interneurons to the motor, I think, also goes in just one direction. But there is this interconnectivity among the interneurons. So without delving into too much detail, I just wanted to show the main results. So they analyzed this model to help to understand how it works. So they use two different methods. One is using traditional dynamical systems-based methods, using tools like bifurcation and things like that. And then they also used information theory-based methods. So here is the results that they found using the traditional geometrical dynamical systems methods. So what they found was there is one neuron called N3. So it's one of the three interneurons. It basically stores the information about the size of the first ball. So at the end of the first phase, the first phase is when the first ball completes its fall. They found that the state of neuron N3 correlates with the size of the first ball. So the larger the first ball is, the larger the state of N3 is. And then in the second phase, neuron N1 kicks into action, and N3 interacts with neuron and somehow transfers the information to N1. And then the state of N1 is what finally helps the agent decide whether it should catch or avoid the ball. So it happens in two ways. So the state of N1 is actually a bistable state. So it can, so we're looking at this figure here. The horizontal axis is time. The vertical axis is the state of N1. So the blue lines represent the possible stable states of N1. So as you can see, there are two possibilities separated by what's known as a saddle state. It's an unstable state that separates the two stable states. So as you can see, under some conditions, the state of N1 is absorbed into the lower tractor, and under other conditions, it's absorbed into the higher lower tractor. And if N1 is off, it actually means that the second ball is smaller, and it just directly means that the agent will catch the ball. But if N1 is on, it means that the second ball is larger, and then it will help agent avoid the ball by moving away from it. So the basic idea here is that so what is this analysis showing us? It again helps answer the question of what are the neurons doing. So this is not image recognition, so we cannot ask what is the neuron looking for, but this is helping answer the question of what the neurons are, um, what sort of information about the environment, in this case the ball, that these neurons are holding. So it turns out that the N3 is sort of specialized in storing information about the first ball, and N1 translates the decision into behavioral outputs and helps, using bistability, it helps decide whether it should catch or avoid. So that's a bistable decision. In a later paper, they used information theoretical methods to complement the dynamical systems analysis. They kind of found similar results. So the first result is, again, N3 um, stores information about the first ball. So in this figure, this axis is time, and this represents the size of the first ball, and the vertical axis represents what's known as mutual information between the size of the ball and the state of N3. So if you don't know what mutual information is, it's basically a generalization of a generalized measure of correlation. So if there is high mutual information between X and Y, then knowing the value of X can help us determine the value of Y with high confidence and vice versa. So that's what the mutual information represents. And as you can see, the mutual information between the size of the first ball and the state of N3 grows over time. So it's the same finding as before. But what they also found was there is another neuron, N2, which also seems to store information about the size of the first ball, but slightly differently. And they did some deep analysis by doing lesioning of N2, and then seeing how it affects the performance. And they actually found a drop in performance if you lesion the information contained in N2. So this is the first phase analysis. The second phase, as I mentioned before, N3 somehow interacts with N1 and help the agent make the catch or avoid decision. And the way it works is that it turns out that neuron N1 basically stores the relative information, whether it's smaller or larger, whether the second ball is smaller or larger compared to the first. And that's what we see here. The vertical axis um, is the amount of relative information that N1 stores. And as you can see, over time, that relative information increases, and it turns out that this is information that's used by the agent to make the final decision. So overall, these approaches, the geometrical, which is dynamical systems-based approaches, and the information theoretic approaches, sort of help answer similar questions as the conventional neural networks that I explained before, which is what are the neurons doing? In the first case, in the case of image recognition, it was all about what aspects of the input image do the neurons care about. In this case, it's about what features of the environment do the neurons care about, or what aspects of the task do the neurons care about. Um, but since these networks are recurrent in nature and are more complicated than the traditional feed-forward networks, they require new methods like dynamical systems and information theory. And I wondered what a method if there might be a method analogous to feature visualization that was developed for neural networks might look for recurrent neural networks, and I'm not sure how they might look like. Maybe this class of neural networks do require a special set of techniques. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here. Um, I will finish up with an example from my own work, and Here is a different dynamical model, but also recurrent dynamical model that we developed along with my advisor Mike. We developed this model to understand the phenomenon of developmental patterning in a minimal setting. So we designed this model. The model is basically a one-dimensional network representing a simple tissue. It's a chain of cells that are bidirectionally connected, and hence the recurrence in the model. Where did I submit this? I submitted this to Entropy, the special issue called Foundations of Biological Computation. Sorry, I'm responding to the question on the chat. So again, by virtue of the symmetrical connections between the model, um, uh, the model is recurrent. Also, there are further complexities to the model where every cell has an internal genetic network that's also recurrent in nature because they are bidirectionally connected. And so overall, this is again a recurrent dynamical model, and the goal of the model is to develop a simple gradient-like activity pattern from homogeneous conditions. Um, the aim of the model was sort of to understand the patterning phenomenon that occurs during early embryogenesis, but for our purpose, that does not really matter. So here's a slide that shows how a trained model works. So the horizontal axis represents the cells. In our model, we had just 12 cells, and the vertical axis represents the activity state. And as you can see from homogeneous conditions, from everything being zero, the network manages to develop a somewhat smooth gradient-like pattern that tapers off at the boundaries. Um, uh, so now the question, so for the paper, we asked the question, how does this work? Um, so to answer that question, I used again a method analogous to the gradient saliency method, except that we now applied it to a recurrent model, which is this model. And what I basically measured was the derivative of the state of a cell at a given point in time with respect to the state of some other cell at time equals zero. So that helps us understand how the initial state of the network helps influence the future states. And we can then visualize those derivatives in the form of a network. So since this is a temporally unfolded network, we can compute a causal network at every single time point. So without going into too much detail, what we found was that the network started out very simply because the model itself is symmetrical. So the relationships also were sort of symmetrical, but over time that symmetry was broken. And then at the attractor state, what we found was that the intercellular relationships breaks into two compartments, an anterior compartment and a posterior compartment. And the anterior compartment interacts itself via a positive feedback loop overall. And then the anterior compartment overall suppresses the posterior compartment. So that's one way to understand why we see a gradient-like pattern that has positive values on the anterior half and negative values at the posterior half. So um, so this was our attempt at helping understand or helping bridge the gap between the structure of the model, which was the original model, as you saw before, a chain of cells, and bridge the gap between the structure and the function, which is the development of the activity pattern. So to so so we sort of answered the question of how the pattern activity develops by saying that the intercellular relationships sort of resemble a gradient-like pattern itself. And so we explain the function in terms of the structure itself. And of course, there are still many open questions as to how this structure itself, this macro scale structure itself arises in the first place. Why was the symmetry broken? And we have explained we proposed some hypotheses as to why that occurs, but still there are a number of open questions. But the broad idea here is to explain the ultimate function of a complex dynamical system in terms of the structure itself. Uh, but overall, again, to bring it all into the main theme of this presentation, which is to interpret a dynamical system. So this method here again helps, at least partially, help answer the question of what the cells were looking for in a way, um, and how the cells were interacting with each other to give rise to the pattern. So to sum up, I started out with these mainstream neural network approaches, um, which um, techniques like feature visualization and attribution uh, that are that are used to understand how traditional neural networks work. But I also introduced other geometric information theoretic and sort of coarse graining approaches to understand how more complex recurrent dynamical systems work. There are other methods that I have not even talked about. For example, causal approaches using Judea-Pearl's do calculus. There are techniques that use these approaches to interpret the inner workings of complex networks, complex systems. Um, but overall, what I've realized from scouring the literature is that um, interpretability helps not only understand how AI systems work, how traditional AI systems work, but I think they also help bridge the gap between structure and function in more generic complex systems. And I think that I would say should be the takeaway message of this presentation. Um, but that's all I had. If you have any questions, we have like 15 minutes, so I'll be happy to answer them. All right. Yeah, let's give us a couple of more minutes. If anyone is still typing out questions, but then we can wrap up if there are no questions in a couple of minutes. There is a question. Do you think we should create regulation to stop non-interpretable AI? Not exactly sure what that means. I'm not sure what you mean by regulation. Stop not interpretable. I think that depends on the application that the AI is used for. For example, perhaps when it comes to things like health, uh, the political regulation, like atomic biological weapons, perhaps. But I would say when it comes to something as crucial as health, perhaps we should not use non-interpretable AI because if an AI is making decisions for us, um, and if we humans do not understand where the decision comes from, as good as that decision might be, perhaps as it plays out in the future, I think I would personally not trust such an AI for making such decisions. And perhaps I've read articles saying describing how doctors use AI systems to make prognosis, and I think perhaps regulations should be introduced under such circumstances. Perhaps they should somehow there should be regulations regarding how or when a doctor can use an AI to make health-related decisions. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Yep, there is a number of papers, especially if you just look up interpretability AI. There's a number of review papers recently because a number of methods have been developed over the years, and I was quite surprised at how many methods there are. And the review papers do a great job explaining the pros and cons of all those various methods and under what circumstances they are applicable and so on and so forth. So the review papers are really good. The one that I mentioned here, um, yeah, this one over here, that's the most recent one that I found, and that's really a good one. And of course, as I mentioned before, you should definitely, if you're interested in feature visualization for traditional neural networks, definitely check out Chris Ola's work. Uh, I'll actually type out the name in case you don't know who I'm talking about. So this is the person, Chris Ola. Um, he has published a number of articles on this, so definitely check it out. Because as simple as computing a derivative like this is not, apparently it turns out it's not as straightforward as it sounds, and there are a number of technical wrinkles that need to be ironed out before you can get good visualizations. So yeah. All right, I'm guessing that's it. Um, Thank you for tuning in, everyone. And I'm not sure when the next episode will be, but until then, take care, everyone, and happy holidays and happy New Year.